That morning Lydia did not cry. She had expected to. She had stood in front of the small oval mirror in the dressing room, not the large one in the master suite, because she had stopped using that one 18 months ago, around the time she stopped expecting to be seen in it, and she had waited for her eyes to fill. They did not. She smoothed the front of her dress, set down her hairpin on the edge of the washstand, and went downstairs to see that breakfast was properly laid. That was the thing about Lydia Ashmore. She always made sure breakfast was properly laid. The marriage had been arranged in the autumn of 1887, when Lydia was 23, and her father's textile business had just suffered its second bad quarter in a row. She had understood the arrangement perfectly. There was no pretense made of love, no performance of romantic courtship. Frederick Ashmore was 41, recently widowed, and possessed of a wool estate in the hill country outside Harrowfield that produced more income in a season than her father's entire operation. He needed a wife who could manage a household. Her family needed security. The contract was written, as all such contracts were, in the language of mutual benefit. Frederick had not been unkind about it. He had met her twice before the wedding, once at a dinner her aunt arranged, once at a garden party, where they had stood beside a rose trellis and exchanged 7 or 8 sentences about the weather. He had told her he appreciated order. He had told her the house had been without proper management since Catherine died. He had not told her much else. She had not expected much else. What she had not anticipated. And this was the thing she turned over in her mind during the years that followed. The thing she could not quite make peace with was how completely she would disappear inside the life she was running. The Ashmore estate sat on a long rise above a river valley, 200 acres of grazing land and managed timber, with a house that had 14 rooms and a staff of 9. When Lydia arrived as a new bride in December of that year, the cook, Mrs. Hartley, had been running the kitchen on instinct and prayer for 4 months. The account books had not been balanced since Catherine's death. 3 of the household linens had been sent to the wrong laundress. A bill from the Harrowfield chandler had gone unpaid for 6 weeks. Lydia spent the first month simply learning where everything was. She learned which suppliers Frederick trusted, and which ones had been overcharging since his first wife's illness made oversight impossible. She learned that the head groundsman, a man named Potts, needed to be asked the same thing twice before he would actually do it, but that if you asked him in front of his assistant, he would do it immediately and without complaint. She learned that the dining room fireplace drew poorly, unless the flue was opened a precise quarter turn, and that if you failed to do this, the room would fill with smoke by 7 o'clock, and Frederick would say nothing, but would press his lips together in a way that meant he had noticed. She learned that Frederick noticed a great many things that were wrong. He did not, as far as she could tell, notice things that were right. This was not cruelty. She understood that. He was a man of his time and his class and his temperament, and the smooth running of a household was, to him, the expected backdrop of a life, not an achievement in itself. When the dinner was late, he noticed. When the dinner arrived on time and was perfectly prepared, and the conversation was appropriately managed, and the right guests had been seated beside each other, and the whole evening moved as it should, he simply experienced it as an evening that had gone as evenings ought to go. She told herself this for 7 years. She told herself it was enough to do the work, that the work itself was the point. She was not sure she believed it anymore. The question of Frederick's first wife had always lived in the house the way cold air lives in an old room. Present, felt, not spoken of directly. Catherine Ashmore had died of a fever in the spring of 1886, after 14 years of marriage. There were no children. There were portraits in the upstairs hall, a small watercolor on the landing, a set of initialed handkerchiefs in the linen chest that Lydia had quietly moved to a cedar box in the attic at the end of her 2nd year. Not from jealousy. She wanted to be clear about that, even in her own accounting of it. From practicality. From the simple fact that a house cannot be run well if it is organized around someone who is no longer there to use it. She had not told Frederick about the handkerchiefs. She had told herself it was a small thing, not worth mentioning. She told herself that for a long time. The dinner party was Reginald Holt's idea. Reginald was Frederick's oldest friend and business partner, a man who laughed loudly and ate heartily and managed to be both enormously likable and entirely unreliable in matters of finance. He had proposed the dinner 6 weeks in advance, a gathering of 8, to celebrate the completion of a contract they had both been pursuing for 3 years. A supply arrangement with a mill group out of the north that would significantly expand the estate's revenue. Frederick had told Lydia about it on a Tuesday morning over breakfast, in the same tone he used to mention that the farrier was coming. or that he expected rain. Lydia had organized the dinner in the weeks that followed with the same thoroughness she brought to everything. She had written to the Holts, to the Davenports, to Frederick's solicitor Mr. Crane and his wife, and to a gentleman named Mr. Aldous Fitch, who was apparently important to the mill contract. She had consulted Mrs. Hartley about the menu 4 times. She had arranged for the dining room to be freshly dressed, for the good silver to be polished, for flowers to come up from the garden. She had written out the placement cards herself, having determined, through careful inquiry, that Mr. Fitch had recently had a disagreement with the Davenports over a land boundary dispute and should therefore not be seated within direct line of them. On the evening itself, she dressed in the blue silk Frederick had approved for formal occasions. He had opinions about her dress, not often stated but present in the way he looked at her when she wore something that did not suit. And she went downstairs at 6 to check that everything was in order. It was in order. It always was. The guests arrived in good spirits. Reginald Holt was louder than usual, which meant the contract news was even better than expected. His wife, a thin, pleasant woman named Dorothea, not the Dorothea Lydia knew from church but another one from Harrowfield proper, smiled warmly at Lydia and said the flowers were beautiful. Mr. Fitch, as Lydia had anticipated, was a careful man who watched a room before he entered it. She made sure he was comfortable before the others settled. The dinner went well. It went better than well. Mrs. Hartley had managed a lamb that was properly pink, and the conversation moved with the easy confidence of people who had just done something successfully together. Reginald told a story about the first time he and Frederick had attempted to negotiate with northern mill owners, 20 years ago, and the table laughed at the right moments. Lydia listened, and spoke when spoken to, and kept one eye on the kitchen door. It was toward the end of the second course that Frederick turned to her. He was mid-sentence, talking to Mr. Crane about something related to the contract terms, and he reached for the salt without looking, and his hand almost touched hers before he drew it back, and then he turned and looked at her, with the expression of a man who has just remembered, there is someone beside him. "Catherine," he said, "would you ask Patterson to?" He stopped. The table did not stop, not entirely. There was a half-second of continuation, Reginald finishing a word, the solicitor's wife reaching for her glass. Before the sound in the room dropped in the way that sound does when something has happened that everyone has registered, but no one has yet decided how to address. Frederick blinked. He opened his mouth. He said quietly, "Forgive me, Lydia. Would you ask Patterson to have the wine brought from the lower cellar?" "Of course," Lydia said. She pushed back her chair with the same steadiness she brought to everything. She caught Patterson's eye near the door. She gave him the instruction. She returned to her seat. She did not look at Frederick. She did not look at Dorothea Holt, who was studying the centerpiece with great concentration. She picked up her fork, and somewhere between setting it down again and the arrival of the third course, she made a decision. She did not know, in that moment, exactly what the decision was. She only knew she had made it. The way you know sometimes before the words arrive. She did not sleep that night. She lay in her room. Her room, the one she had occupied since the second year of their marriage, when it became quietly understood that the arrangement of the master suite was not a thing Frederick pursued. And she looked at the ceiling and thought with great precision. She thought about 7 years. She thought about the account books and the supplier negotiations and the social calendar and the dinner this evening and every dinner before it. She thought about the way Frederick had looked at her, not cruelly, never cruelly, with the expression of a man correcting an administrative error. Catherine. He had called her Catherine. She had known, for years, that she occupied the role Catherine had held. She had understood that from the beginning. What she had not understood, what she saw clearly now, in the particular clarity that comes at 2 in the morning, after a thing has finally been said out loud, was that Frederick did not see the distinction between the role and the person in it. He had needed someone to run the house. He had acquired someone to run the house. And when he looked at that someone, some part of his mind still reached for the word that had been attached to that function for 14 years before her. She was not angry. That surprised her. She had perhaps expected, when this moment came, and some part of her had known it would come, that she would be angry. Instead, she felt something quieter and more final, the feeling of a door closing gently on a room you have been standing in for a very long time. In the weeks after the dinner, Lydia did not change anything. This was deliberate. She continued to manage the household with the same exactness. She continued to appear at breakfast, to answer correspondence, to speak with Potts about the grounds, and with Mrs. Hartley about provisions. She continued to sit across from Frederick at meals, and to listen when he spoke, and to reply with appropriate economy. But she had begun, very quietly, to count. She counted the money she had received since the marriage, the allowance Frederick provided for household expenses, which she had always managed with scrupulous efficiency, spending less than was allocated, and recording the difference in a small ledger she kept in her writing box. 7 years of careful management. The difference was not enormous, but it was enough. She wrote 2 letters. The first was to her cousin Harriet, not the Harriet in the account above, a different one, her mother's sister's daughter, who had moved to Edinburgh 4 years ago and who had written, last winter, to say that the house next door to her own had come available for let. Lydia had not replied to that letter at the time. She replied now. The second letter was to Frederick. She wrote it at the small desk in her sitting room on a Thursday afternoon, with the light coming in gray from the garden, and she took her time with it. She did not write in anger. She was not performing restraint. She genuinely felt none. She wrote the way she wrote any careful document, with clarity about facts, acknowledgement of complexity, and precision about terms. She wrote that she understood the nature of their arrangement and had entered it without illusion. She wrote that she had tried, in the years since, to fulfill her part of it completely and believed, on review, that she had. She wrote that she did not blame him for what had happened at the dinner, because she did not believe he had meant it as a wound. And this was, she wrote, perhaps the most honest thing she could say about all of it. That what hurt was not what he had meant, but what he had revealed without meaning to. She wrote that she would be leaving on Saturday morning. She had made arrangements. She would be staying with her cousin in Edinburgh until she had determined what came next. She was not asking his permission or his opinion. She was providing him the information he would need to make appropriate arrangements for the house. She signed it. Lydia, not Mrs. Ashmore, just Lydia. The name she had been before she was a function in someone else's life. She had expected him to come to her sitting room on Friday. She had prepared, in a general way, for a conversation in which he would be reasonable, and she would be required to remain composed. Instead, he found her at 4 o'clock in the garden, standing near the old yew hedge where she had planted bulbs the previous autumn, and he came down the path with the letter held slightly away from his body, as if he was not entirely sure what to do with it. He looked, she thought, like a man who had just been handed a document he had not anticipated and had not yet finished reading. Lydia, he said. Frederick. He stood at the edge of the stone path and looked at her for a long moment. She waited. She had learned, over 7 years, that the most useful thing she could do when Frederick was composing himself was to wait. I didn't realize, he said finally, that you were unhappy. She considered the word. It was not wrong exactly, but it was not quite the thing either. She had not spent 7 years being unhappy in the way of a woman who had been denied happiness. She had spent 7 years being absent, being useful and present and invisible all at once. These were not the same thing, and she found, standing here with the yew hedge behind her and the letter in his hand, that she did not have the energy to explain the difference. I know, she said. I know you didn't realize. He was quiet again. He looked at the garden, at the beds she had planted, the paths she had persuaded him to have relaid 3 years ago, the small iron bench she had chosen from a catalogue while he was in town. He looked at it the way he looked at the dinner table, seeing that it was as it should be, not seeing the years of effort that had made it so. The Fitch contract, he said. There are still matters outstanding. The correspondence with the northern solicitors. I've left everything in the blue ledger, she said. On the desk. It's all in order. He looked at her. Something in his face shifted, not quite to something she could name, but shifted. She had the sudden sense that he was, for the first time in a long time, actually seeing her, not as a component of the household, not as the woman occupying the function, as Lydia. It was, she thought, about 7 years late. Is there nothing I can? He stopped, started again. If things were to change, I don't know, she said honestly. I genuinely don't know, Frederick. He nodded slowly. He held the letter for another moment. Then he folded it, carefully, and placed it in his coat pocket, and walked back up the path to the house. She left before sunrise on Saturday. Not for drama, not to avoid a scene. She had simply looked at the train schedule and discovered that the earliest departure was at 5:40. And it was a 3-mile walk to the Harrowfield station, and she did not want to trouble anyone for the cart at that hour. She carried 1 bag. The rest she had arranged to be sent on. She had, of course, arranged this a week ago. The path down from the estate wound through the lower field, and then through a stile onto the road to town. It was still dark when she started walking, the sky the particular blue-gray of early morning, before anything has quite decided to be day, and there was a mist off the river that settled at her knees and caught the light from her small lantern. She thought of the house behind her, of the breakfast she had not arranged for this morning, the first morning in 7 years she had not arranged it, and she felt unexpectedly a brief stab of something. Not regret, not grief exactly, the particular tenderness you feel for a thing you have cared for well, even when the caring has cost you. She kept walking. The station was empty at that hour, except for a station master who took her ticket without comment, and a farmer with 2 crates of something that smelled of wet straw. She sat on a wooden bench in the thin light and watched the platform and waited for the train. She was 29 years old. She had 20 pounds in her bag, a letter from Harriet with an Edinburgh address, and 7 years of knowledge about how to manage more than most people would ever be asked to manage. She was not afraid. She was not, if she was honest, even particularly sad. She was, for the first time in a long time, aware of herself as a person with a future rather than a function with a present. The train came at 5:42, only slightly late. She picked up her bag and she got on. Frederick's letter arrived in Edinburgh 11 days later. Harriet brought it to her at the small table by the window where Lydia had taken to working in the mornings. She had already begun corresponding with a solicitor's office that her cousin knew, regarding the accounting work she suspected she could do, and set it beside her tea without comment. Harriet was a practical woman, one of the things Lydia had always appreciated about her. The letter was 3 pages in Frederick's precise hand. He wrote that he had spoken with the solicitors. He wrote that he had been reviewing, in the weeks since she left, the household accounts and the correspondence files and the management records. He wrote this in the neutral tone of a man making an inventory, and Lydia read it in the same spirit. He was cataloging what he had lost. She understood that. Then he wrote something else. He wrote that on the morning after she left, he had gone down to breakfast at his usual hour and found the room empty and the table unlaid. Not from failure. She had left clear instructions with Mrs. Hartley, but because Mrs. Hartley had thought, not unreasonably, that given the circumstances, no one would be coming down for breakfast. He had stood in the dining room for some time, he wrote. He had looked at the room in a way he had not looked at it before. He wrote, "I am not certain I knew what I had. I am more certain now that I did not see it properly. I am least certain about whether I am capable of the seeing that would have prevented this. I think you deserve someone who does not have to learn to see you. I am also not prepared to pretend that what I want is irrelevant to me." He wrote that he was not asking her to come back. He was asking if she would be willing to have a conversation, when she was ready, about what coming back might require, if she found she wanted that, and what it would need to mean if it were to mean anything. He signed it, Frederick, not Mr. Ashmore. Frederick. Lydia set the letter down beside her tea, and looked out at the Edinburgh street, where a woman was walking a dog in the grey morning light and 2 boys were running for reasons that seemed important only to them. She thought about the blue ledger left on his desk. About Potts and the way you had to ask him twice. About the rose beds and the iron bench and 14 rooms, and the accounts and 7 years of mornings she would never get back. She thought about the dining room. About the way the table had gone quiet. She thought about the man who had spent 7 years not seeing her, writing 3 pages to say, "I am trying now to look." She did not write back that day. She let the letter sit. She finished her tea and she went back to work, but she did not throw it away.